Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me and allowing an outsider to talk with you today for about 30 minutes, actually. Betsy asked, she said, just give us the history of family medicine from start to finish and tell us what our future is going to be from the point of view of somebody who's known family medicine for a couple of years. So you can imagine this is a little daunting, but I'm going to give it a shot, and from an ethnographic point of view, and there are 4 things I'd like to do today. And one of them is to test 3 hypotheses with you that I've been working on primarily from listening to many members of the family medicine community and from doing some reading and just spending a lot of time learning what family medicine physicians and others say about themselves and their specialty. I'd like to explore these 3 hypotheses using 3 stories. Not so much telling the stories specifically, but talking about the kinds of structure of those narratives, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a sec. And then after that, I would like to think with you about the implications of these 3 stories for a possible future for family medicine. And then pause and open up the floor for your thoughts and questions and ways in which you'd like to bring your experience to bear on the kinds of things I'd like to discuss with you. So the 3 hypotheses are these. The first is that family medicine as a specialty is entering a maturation phase following, say, a formal birth, although not an actual birth. You could go back way before 1969, but using that just as a marker of the birth of the specialty, through adolescence, where I believe the specialty is now, into this maturation process that I think is ahead of family medicine and not too far ahead. Second is I'd like to suggest that a professional identity, like the identity of family medicine, is only as strong as its ability to adapt and change to the circumstances surrounding it. And the third is that while family medicine cannot, and while we cannot control all the contextual forces at play around us, there are ways to really influence those forces if we pay attention to them rigorously. Please think about these. These are in the background. We'll come back to these at the end. I'd love to test these hypotheses with you today and ask you to join me in thinking through them. And to do this, I'd like to explore them through 3 stories. These are stories that are compilations of what I've heard from, say, the last 2 years of work on family medicine for America's health, the strategic planning effort with the 8 family medicine organizations, and with some of the reading I've done, and I'm sure it's informed by, I don't know, we've been working in healthcare as a consulting firm for 20 plus years. But I want to do this through the lens of an ethnographer rather than a typical kind of management consulting lens. And by that I mean that in ethnography, ethno means native, graphy, as you know, means the study of or the writing about. And so what ethnographers do is we study people in their native habitat, groups, how they live, what their rules for behavior are. And many anthropologists go to far-flung exotic places to do that. I prefer how exotic we are. Are we not the most exotic creatures on the planet that take for granted all the rules we've created for ourselves and imagine we understand ourselves? So I want to just think about these stories in that ethnographic kind of way. And for that purpose, I'd like to use Clifford Geertz's definition of culture, who's a famous anthropologist who many of you may know of. He taught at Princeton for many years. And his theory was, or his statement was, that culture is the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And these 3 stories are stories that I've been hearing family medicine people in the community of family medicine tell about yourselves. And the first one is a story about professional identity, and it's really the core story of who are we. The second is a story about creative tensions in the specialty. And that's really about what's best for the profession. And lots of people have their points of view about that. The third story is really that story about survival. Can we adapt? Can we adapt and thrive? And that's a question that's especially pertinent, I think, since 2000 right up till today. So, as far as the identity story goes, which I think is the core narrative of family medicine, I've been picking these points that say 1969 as the birth of the specialty, 2000 to 2000, or up to 2015, say, as its adolescence, and suggesting to you that it's on the cusp of maturity, and that has a lot of implications which I want to discuss with you. And this first story, as an identity story, I think you'll recognize the characteristics of this identity. First and usual source of contact, personal doctor, understands the implications of the psychological and social determinants of health. Family physicians treat the whole person. Longitudinal care is critical, and so is the partnership with mental, behavioral, and public health in order to create communities of solution and solve the problems of population health. Coordinated, integrated care is critical for successful family medicine, as is the continuity of care. The strong, ongoing relationship with patients and their families, sometimes over generations. Ongoing person-centered, patient-centered care. And finally, what I really took away more than anything from reading Barbara Starfield was the importance of comprehensive care. How many of you have never heard this litany? And I ask you, if we were here in 1969, would these words, most of them, be up here? And when we worked on the strategic plan and it got finalized in 2014 and all 8 family medicine boards signed off on it, that's what's in the strategic plan about the identity of family medicine and the expectations that patients should be able to have of the discipline and its physicians. So what I'm trying to say here is that you have a very powerful identity narrative that's the core narrative of family medicine. It's what people inducted through residency programs into the tribe learn. It's the core, it's the sum total of the core values, beliefs, and assumptions that drive the mission. It's powerful. It's lasted now for generations, and ideally will last for generations more. And it doesn't, the power is that it doesn't change. That's the first story. The second story, this got a little more complicated for me because I kept hearing people say, what's best for the profession? And every time they said something, they would say it, but they would say it not only stressing one position, but it would be versus something else that's not best. And after a while, I realized that these weren't individual positions, they were really pairs. And these pairs go together. And what's valuable about these is something that Barry Johnson, a colleague, has put together on what he calls polarity management. And what he says is that there are some things in a discipline that are problems to solve, but there are other things that are dilemmas to manage. And family medicine has a number of dilemmas to manage. They're not going away. And so to learn how to manage them effectively is the key to success. And I want to talk about a couple of them. Edge and center, and personal relationships versus complex diagnosis. In 1979, when Gail Stevens was talking with you, who introduced that wonderful difference between sect and church in 1979 at STFM's annual meeting, I think, right? I really liked this distinction because when you're in a sect, you're on the margin. And on the margin, you have a lot of flexibility. You can throw lots of stuff into the center and get away with it. And but what happened in 1969 was that there was an invitation after the many commissions realized that there was a missing role and family physicians decided to fill it. that there was an invitation into the mainstream of the church of medicine. And that had consequences. And so some people believe that it's far better to be on the edge. Others believe family medicine needs to be at the center. And there are pluses if you want to be at the edge. You can stimulate change and reform and not worry just about the growth and expansion of the discipline. But there are negatives as well. And negatives to that center role, all the compromises you have to make to be part of the healthcare industrial complex. But the interesting thing about dilemmas is that there are also negatives. If there's a negative to the church side, there's negatives to the sect side as well. It's difficult to garner resources when everybody's doing their own thing. When patients are moving, something like I read a statistic about 30% of the, not 30%, but it was way above 20% of Americans are moving around each year. And how are patients going to know what to expect from a family physician if it's all about choosing your own adventure? And there are positives as well to the church side of the equation. And you can promote the specialty, leverage opportunities, go after resources as a collective entity, compete with others effectively, and grow the discipline and its reputation. So my recommendation is that especially as adolescence occurs in the specialty, that the way to do this is, instead of thinking of either ors when there are polarities to manage, try to figure out how do you feature the positives of both ends of the polarity and keep that tension alive, because then in one context you can emphasize the church dimension, in another context the sect. So let's take one more. And this was really interesting because it took a while before I heard this, because I believed, everyone says that it's all about personal relationships, that's what really matters, and that every patient deserves a personal relationship with a family physician. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought, gee, that's great, I'd love that. And my family doc is a DO, and terrific physician. But then someone said to me, that may be a blind spot, because actually what we do that differentiates us from other specialties is the complexity of our diagnosis. So I started trying this on, and the plus side of relationships is clear. Who isn't proud when a patient says, because you know me, because you know my family, you made a difference in my life and my health? And let's face it, dealing with uncertainty and the complexity of what family medicine does generates things like the hidden curriculum. But there are also negatives on the side of focusing on personal relationships. Perhaps one of the reasons family medicine gets less respect from other disciplines is because it doesn't emphasize and state clearly what the complexity of diagnosis actually is and how valuable it can be. And on the plus side, not all patients want a personal relationship with a family physician. The data is clear, at different points in their lives especially. And the diagnosis, and now there's work going on to, as you all know, to try and get family physicians paid more money, because the complexity of the diagnosis exceeds that of many specialties in the same amount of time that a patient is with a family physician. So what I would encourage is that, and what I've learned from you all, from listening, is that those people who move from a position versus another position to managing the complexities of polarity have a resource they didn't have before, in that they can decide to foreground or background different parts of the polarity depending on the context that they're in. The third story is about changes in context. And the question that I've heard a lot of people talk about in the family medicine community: how can we adapt to the changes that we're facing, and what are we going to do in order to survive and thrive? I mean, look at the match rates. There are all sorts of things people bring up about this. I want to just introduce this idea from my background about tradition. And one of the things we learned in our training is that tradition really isn't the old, just bringing out the old songs and old stories around the campfire once in a while, although that's what I thought folklore was when I first started. But it actually is something that combines conservation with innovation. Conservation plus innovation. And what's wonderful about that is that a healthy tradition survives because it can address opposition as it comes and is able to adapt to a changing context. And as we know, it's context that shapes what's possible and what's not in any given situation. So I'd like to explore this a little bit by taking 2 points in time and walking through a couple of dimensions of context with you, socioeconomic and the context of the healthcare industry, and then take those 2 points in time and think about what's the impact on family medicine, how does it differ, and what are the challenges as a result. So if you take the, this is probably too small to see. Let me start with socioeconomic for everybody. Can you all see back there? Okay, thanks. These are just more provocation than complete kinds of ideas. They're just a suggestion that context matters and that we can influence it. So if you think about the late 60s and early 70s in the political arena, it was a real time of a rising middle class. It was a time of optimism still. It was a time of real cultural debate about authority and movements about equality and diversity of all sorts. On the other hand, and those of you who were there, how many people were there for the late 60s and early 70s, just out of curiosity? Oh, quite a few. Okay, great. And others of you talked to these people. It was a fascinating time. And some of us have nostalgia about it. But anyway, take 2000 to the present as another period. Very different, more centrist to conservative. Recessions at either end, and in some cases, Main Street still feeling the recession, even though Wall Street has been highly successful. Then there's this funny thing that's very different about this digital revolution. While there's the corporatization of everything, there's also this entrepreneurial thing going on where people are starting their own businesses. It's kind of like that edge and center, both at the same time. So that's one layer of context. Take another layer. In the healthcare industry, in the late 60s, early 70s, GDP, what was it, 4.5 to 6 or 8? 6.5 to 8? Look at the difference now. Look at the pressure going toward 20%. And of course, we had in the healthcare industry, it was the AMA and Public Health and others that sponsored these 3 reports. And there was no real training at the time, and look at the just giant loss of general practitioners. Very, very different from right now, where it's really a very shifting role for CMS, covering more and more of a percentage of the population, and digital technology driving this rapid change everywhere in healthcare. Now, these are just ideas. You can fill in the context yourself. Think about what else is going on from your point of view. And then what's the impact of family medicine? And this is one of the reasons I want to suggest about birth and adolescence, that at the birth of family medicine, there was excitement, optimism, amazing excitement that, hey, that family medicine was the answer to an important question, a role that was missing that needed to be generated. 350 or more residencies in 10 years, that's incredible. And look at the period from 2000 to the present. And this is what's interesting about adolescence. Whether it's a specialty, an organization, an industry, all goes through the same pattern. After that birth and that excitement period, there's a period of increased competition because others are learning how to do what you do. There's a rise in subspecialties also competing. And then there's this question that comes up always about value. Can the practice prove its value? And the way I've been thinking about it, and see if this resonates for you, I think that Keystone 3 conference that was so important, leading to Future of Family Medicine 1.0, leading to FMA Health, is all one thing. It's one event. It's not 3 different events. It's one period of time in the adolescence of the specialty where the question is, can family medicine prove its value? And so what I want to suggest to you for thought is that you have an incredibly strong identity as a core narrative that weaves through history, that you also have core tensions, creative tensions that can be incredibly valuable to you, and that its context and the differing contexts that mean family medicine has to adapt differently in 2015 than it did in, say, the late 60s and through the 70s. That context matters. And I think that Darwin had it right, because it's not the most intelligent who survive, and it's not the strongest who survive. It's those who are able to adapt. And I believe that family medicine can do that. And so what I want to try on for you is taking these 3 stories and saying, well, what are the implications for family medicine's future? And this is where I'm going to take a flyer, everybody. So you may think I'm crazy, but I'm going to go for it anyway and see what happens. So here's my thought. Let's just do an experiment and say we are now doing a history of the future. It's 2025, and we have to talk about 2015 in the past tense. And family medicine's been very successful. And they've been very successful because, as a specialty, you've been able to build on your core, the strength of your core identity narrative, and you've grown to a point where you've paid attention to these contextual forces at play, and you've decided, yes, we may be able to influence them. How did family medicine adapt? Well, you did 5 or 6 things. It was really amazing, and you were all there in 2015, so you'll probably remember some of these things and how they turned out. But what was interesting is, by focusing on the identity narrative, the first thing you learned was that you wanted to be patient-centered, but you really didn't understand what that meant. Is that fair? But because no one else was even interested, you capitalized that, and you started going out to patients and finding out what it actually meant to be patient-centered, to be focused on health and not only illness. In addition, you learn to manage those tensions that I was talking about earlier, and those proved to be very helpful to you because you no longer ended up having enemies that you had before. So it wasn't us versus them inside academic medicine. It was really, we need to be at the edge and the center, and we need to leverage our skills and capabilities to address both. You took up leadership in a time of increased competition, but you didn't do it by telling people what to do. It's like the 2 leaders in the video earlier. You decided to take up leadership by creating a common vision with others in a very interdisciplinary way in primary care to prove the value of primary care and take into account the interests of others and understanding how they work in order to lead through understanding how they all create value. And the reason I want to bring this up in STFM is because you have such a diverse organization. I mean, it's like being with an interdisciplinary team, in effect. How many people are not family physicians? Raise your hands. Perfect example. And do we have social work in the house? Nurse practitioners at all? How about mental health, public health? It's really like, and I'm sorry to those of you I missed, feel free to shout it out. PAs, thank you. And, but that's the beauty of STFM, and that was, I think, Leland Blanchard's vision too, in the purpose statement that he wrote about STFM. So it's the interdisciplinary team that you have the opportunity to lead forward. The other thing that happened, and this started around 2016, it was really fascinating, but family medicine realized that its internal squabbles were just sideshows. And they were sideshows that other disciplines could drive a truck through to slow them down. And so they realized, hey, this is ridiculous. We have bigger fish to fry. We have to change primary care, and we don't have time for these internal squabbles. They're not going to split us. And that was pretty remarkable. Because, you know, the difference between adolescence and maturity, really, in a discipline is often moving from an internal focus on ourselves to an external focus on those we say we're in the business of serving. And that was amazing when that started to happen. It amazed even people who were squabbling. Finally, family medicine took advantage of the forces that were at play, some of which we talked about earlier, those socio-political forces, industry forces, things that were going on in family medicine. And they decided to use them as horses to ride to the future. And they did that, and I was amazed when this happened. But people actually said, we believe that the history of the future we want to create, is actually already here in pockets around the country. And the first question we need to ask is, where is it already happening? In lots of different people and places and creative innovation around the country. And we've asked this question in so many different industries, I can't tell you. And we've almost gotten booted out of the room for it, but I would tell you that if we had 3 or 4 hours, we would have this room plastered with examples of the way the desired future you want to create is already showing up all over this country. And to answer the question, what family medicine did, which was really interesting, was they began to look at where the future's happening in these different settings. So they said, oh my God, the ACA it's really happening, and guess what? If it's headed toward 20% cost of healthcare as a percentage of GDP, it's not a bipartisan issue. This train has left the station and it's not coming back. And that was a good bet, turned out to be a good bet. They realized that loyalty has changed. The definition of loyalty has changed. There's no longer any kind of assurance you're going to be working in the same place for very many years. And younger people know this, that it's all about you have to take care of yourself and learn the skills you need to get your next job. This was a really wonderful thing for family medicine because family medicine needed independent kinds of thinkers who were ready to take more of a risk than perhaps had been taken for a while. In the healthcare industry, family medicine said, wow, Medicare, Medicaid, over 50% of the population no longer monitors, they're really shapers. And when things came out in 2015 that were stunning, do you remember in 2015? I don't know, most of you were in this room at that time. Do you remember that all of a sudden the SGR was repealed and it accelerated the movement toward alternative-based payment? Do you remember that? Do you remember how some of you bitched and moaned about they weren't the quality measures you liked and all that stuff, but still they were moving, accelerating the rapid pace of change toward alternative payment away from fee-for-service? That was a big deal. We didn't know even how big a deal it was at the time. But, you know, that roadmap to 2019, when you look back on it, it feels like a blink. And remember when the academic medical centers, they finally got the idea that they needed to deal with population health, but they didn't have a clue because they didn't know what primary care meant? Do you remember that? Do you? All right. And uh-oh, that's my 30-minute mark. Sorry. I'll speed this up. Anyway, you get the idea. In family medicine, the future's already here as well. Look at the experiments in direct primary care. Look at all the experiments going on in interdisciplinary teams where the data is showing that physicians don't lose the close relationship they have with their patients. Look at the flipping the frame preceptor programs that are going on, where students are actually helping docs get results they weren't able to get before. These are all happening already. This is not, you all know this, and or most of you, I'm sure, could tell me other locations where these things are happening. So all of these things lit the path forward starting in, way back in 2015. And in 2018, it was remarkable because do you remember when STFM combined their forces with the workforce team that was part of FMA Health and the payment team, and they built the business case to take to deans of medical schools in those first 2 states, and the deans took their case to the provosts and the presidents, and what they discovered is that the presidents and provosts didn't have a clue how to work population health and get results, but family medicine was able to show 20% reduction with investments in the expansion of primary care, and what that did to workforce education, training, and development, and the number of residents that entered the field. Do you remember that? Do you? Thank you. And so this is the kind of future. This is the kind of future that family medicine can have. And as you can see, I'm pretty passionate about it. And the more I've learned about family medicine, the more I believe in its potential. And I believe in the possibility that a very risk-averse, very conservative, keep your light under a bushel specialty can learn how to take what I call smart risks. Those kinds of risks that are smart because you understand how all the contextual forces at play and you decided which horses you're going to ride. So here are those hypotheses. Family medicine's entering a maturing phase. Professional identity is only strong as the ability to adapt, and context matters. And while you can't control the forces at play, you can influence them. The stories we tell ourselves are those things that carry us from the past into the future. In family medicine, there's stories like, who are we? What's best for the profession? And can we adapt? And the strength of the family medicine tradition into the future is going to be built on at least the strength of its core identity, the value of the tensions creatively managed, and the ability to take into account the importance and value of context as you adapt the discipline to meet those challenges. I'll stop there. Thank you.